It's Sunday, June the 1st, and this is a walk and talk video about quite a controversial subject, and it's about your parents, but it's about losing your parents, what happens to you, how that affects you when you lose your mum and dad, particularly if you're a creative person, if you're a film director, if you're a content creator, or if you're a creative director. How does that affect your work? How does it affect your relationships? How does it affect how you move on from losing two of the most precious people in your lives? Because I lost my father 8 years ago. I lost my mum at the end of this month 3 years ago, and I miss them dearly. This video is dedicated to them, and in this video I'm going to talk about how they inspired me to become a film director, how they supported me over the years, the challenges that I did have at times when I did certain things that they didn't agree with, but also about what it means to lose a parent, how that can affect us, how we can move on from such a loss. Because I don't know about anybody else, that for me, one of the most terrifying thoughts when I was a child was losing my parents. You know, as a kid, you looked up to them so much. They took care of you, they fed you, they housed you, they looked after you, and you get these thoughts as a kid, don't you? You get these morbid thoughts of your parents passing away, and it used to absolutely scare the life out of me. And I know I've spoken to other people about this as well, like the thought of losing your parents when you're a child. It's like the ultimate horrific thought that you can have for generating fear, and certainly that was the case for me. I speak to my wife Emma. I'm just going to wait for this noisy car to go past. I speak to my wife Emma, and she had a similar morning. She had similar dreaded thoughts about losing her parents when she was a child, and she said the same thing, that it was one of the worst thoughts that she could have. My wonderful mum was named Marjorie Kavanagh, my dad Peter Kavanagh, and both of them great parents, down to earth, working class, and they always tried their best. My mum she worked in a number of jobs. She was a cleaner, she worked in a canteen, but she mostly did domestic work in our hometown of Merseyside near Liverpool. My dad was a working man. He worked on building sites. They both worked at the BICC, British Insulated Calendar Cables in Prescott. For any of you that may remember that, it's basically a company that creates the wires that transports electricity throughout the UK. And the BICC used to employ thousands of people up north, particularly in Merseyside. All of it's gone now, all of it's been levelled, all of it's been replaced by housing and your local Tesco and your Aldi, unfortunately. But at that time, the BICC employed more people in the north than any other business. And so it had that working class community, it had that real essence of people going to work 5 days a week, having the weekend to chill out. And it used to have this foghorn that would basically sound twice a day to get people into work. So you'd have this like a bit like the siren now, that if there's going to be World War III, it was a bit like that, but you'd hear it from miles away. So it was, growing up as a child, it was so interesting to hear the sound, and you'd know, like as a kid, that was the time that everybody was going to work, that everybody would be in the factories, and you'd see en masse all of these parents leaving to go to work. And then come 5 o'clock, you'd hear the foghorn go again, and you'd know that was the time that mum and dad would be coming home to make you tea and feed you. So thinking about that now, I haven't thought about this in years, so that was really interesting. But I've told in a previous story, if you watch this video here, where I talk about how a low budget filmmaker like me made $3 billion for Hollywood, I talk very much about how my mum and dad took me to see Jaws on my 7th birthday, and that was the thing that completely and utterly inspired me to become a film director. And that's one of the things I want to thank particularly my father for, because he was a complete and utter film buff and nut, and so we would regularly go to the cinema. He would ask me, do I need my pocket money, and we would go to, I just have so many memorable experiences of watching Towering Inferno. Bambi was the first film I watched. I'm going to wait for this car to go past. That was practically traumatizing for me. I watched that in Plymouth at my Auntie Joy's theatre in a very famous cinema. But Bambi was my first movie, but some of the best films I remember seeing with my dad was Towering Inferno many times, Saturday Night Fever, Grease, Jaws numerous times. We went to see Earthquake. We even went to see the B movies like The Swarm, that Michael Caine film with the dodgy bees, and the Star Wars movies. We actually went to see Stand By Me together. That was a memory I can never forget, because we were walking through Liverpool one day and they used to give away these free tickets to people if you came along, and literally they handed us these tickets to this film we'd never heard of. We didn't know it had a cameo or a narration by Richard Dreyfuss, one of our favourite actors from Jaws and Close Encounters. And so I got to see Stand By Me with my dad together, and it's still one of my favourite movies to this day. That memory I cherish to my heart. So I'd love to know in the comments, anybody that's had similar experiences going to see memorable movies with their parents. I'd love to hear what the movie was, where you saw it, and how was that experience for you. That would be really interesting if you'd be up for putting that in the comments. That for me tells me a lot about you. It's also nice to hear those cinematic stories with the folks. So back to my wonderful folks. So I left Liverpool in 1989 to go to film school, and to cut a long story short, I then spent 23 years working and living in London away from my parents. So I would occasionally, probably twice, 3 times a year, go to visit them in Liverpool, birthdays, Christmases, the usual. But definitely that period of time was a period of time where I felt a bit of a distance from my parents, that I didn't get to see them as much as I wanted, because I was so focused on my working life. I got so enraptured in the world of London that I didn't really spend that much time with them. So I did miss them at times. I did miss home, but also it was a period of my life that was essential in terms of bringing me back to what I wanted to do. And again, as I said, it was my father mostly who inspired me to become a film director and a filmmaker. And in that time, unfortunately, my dad left work, because my dad was a smoker his whole life, and he used to work on building sites, and he was one of the unfortunates that worked in a time where there was the asbestos and the dust, and they never wore PPE, and he wouldn't wear the mask. So over time, my dad's health into his late 50s and 60s did deteriorate, because he had inhaled so much debris from the working sites, and also because he was a smoker. So probably in his mid-60s, he started to get the first signs of emphysema, and his eyesight was affected, his hearing was affected, and that was then a period of time that lasted maybe a decade, maybe 10 years, where my dad's health basically slowly but surely deteriorated, and it got to the point where my mum ended up nursing and looking after him. That was a really, really tough time for me, because I was living in London and my mum was going through this struggle with my father. She basically was so reluctant to get home help and to get nursing help, and I was constantly on the phone with her and supporting her to say, you cannot take all of this on yourself. It's too much to take on. This is going to affect your health. It's going to affect your relationship with Dad. And I think it was one Christmas where we definitely had a head-to-head where she finally gave in. I think she'd had enough. She was at this point where she was almost having a nervous breakdown, and she finally gave in and started and agreed to get some support with my father. So that was good news. But again, my mum being my mum, she still couldn't quite let go of looking after her beloved husband. And at this point, he'd had to move from the bedroom to the living room, and he'd become bedridden. His hearing and eyesight had got really bad. I would visit my dad when he was like this, but again, that was quite challenging, being at home to see my dad being so sick and my mum struggling with looking after him. And this was a period of time where, again, that thought came back that I had as a kid, that, it didn't look like my dad was going to possibly get into his late 70s or his 80s, and I was concerned about my mum's health. So what happened was, I'd spent 6 years producing and directing my first documentary called Ex-Dominatrix, A True Story. The day after I finished my movie, my dad passed away in 2017 in November. And also at that point in my life, so many things happened. There was this convergence of these 3 main events. It was finishing my movie, my dad had passed away, and at that time I'd been in a marriage of 17 years, and we both decided that we wanted to end the marriage. And I'd also been going to AA for a couple of weeks. So all of this was happening at the same time, and it was such a tumultuous time in my life that I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but when these things happen, they seem to happen all at the same time. And so I was suddenly in a position where had gone through this creative journey that had come to a standstill. I was basically losing my father, and I was ending a marriage. And I don't know about anybody else, but at that point, I had to give up. I had to surrender. I literally felt completely and utterly beaten. And I wasn't there, unfortunately, when my father did pass away. So I had to drive up to Liverpool on the day that he did pass. But when I was driving, he was still alive. So I literally dropped everything. I had this incredibly harsh stress in my lower back. So I had to drop everything. It took me a few hours. I got in my car and then drove. I mean, I live in Glastonbury, so it was a good 5 or 6 hour drive to go see my father. And I'm driving up to Liverpool. And at about 6:45, I had to pull over. I was about 25 minutes away from the hospital where my dad was. And it was raining. The sun had come down. It was dark. I pulled into a petrol station and I called my brother. I sensed that something had happened. I called my lovely brother Sean, and I basically picked up the phone, and I could tell from the tone in his voice. And I said to Sean, "He's passed, hasn't he?" And my brother said, "Yeah, he's gone." And for me, at that point, recently divorced, 2 weeks in AA, not being there when my father passed, I'd never ever felt so low and lonely and lost in my entire life. It was a point that I remember like it was yesterday, and it was a point that changed my life, but it also was a point that, for me, looking back, I felt so low, I felt so lonely, I felt so separate from everybody else, and it just felt that all was lost. You know, my dear father, who to me meant the earth, who had inspired me to be a film director, was gone. I hadn't been with him there when he'd passed, and my wife at the time, who wasn't with me as well, we were separating, and also I realised that I'd had a drinking issue, and that for me was something that I didn't know I'd had, that I'd been dealing with for 20 years on and off. So for me it was literally like ground zero. It was like everything had come to this point. But what do you do in a moments like that? Well, I had a good old cry. I grabbed that steering wheel, gained my composure, drove very slowly to the hospital, saw my parents, saw my dad who was there. He'd gone, said goodbye, spent time hugging my mum and my brother, and then I stayed for a few days with my mum. Particularly, she was in a right state at that time, and then I had to put things into order for my mum, do what I could, and then I had to drive all the way back to Glastonbury. And at that point, because of what was going on, I had this pain in my lower back. I mean, I think it was just brought on by all the stress and what was happening, that literally I was doubled over driving home. I was in so much agony that by the time I got to Glastonbury and I pulled into the driveway, I walked into the house and I collapsed on the carpet. I literally collapsed on the floor in such agony and pain. And clearly it was a combination of everything else that I'd been going through as well at the time. And the days passed, the funeral had to be arranged, I had to go back up north, and then that was a really, really hard time for me. I then effectively spent 2 years in recovery, not working, not doing any creative work, going to AA, dealing with my divorce, supporting my family as best I could, and I needed that time. I needed that time out to completely and utterly recover, to gain my self-worth, and to reconnect with who I was as a person. And thankfully I got through it. There were some very dark times, there were some very teary nights on my own, but thank God, thank my higher power that I'm still here, that I got through that. But unfortunately my mother, she could never quite get over the loss of Peter, and she turned to the drink quite heavily, to medication, and it was 5 years that she did the best she could with what she had. My sister, my brother and I supported her as best we could. Particular shout out to my sister, who was there for her so much in this time. I mean, I was away in Glastonbury. My brother lives a bit further away from my mum, but I want to shout out to my wonderful sister who supported my mum through that time. And before this, my mum had a lot of headaches, and I'd gone and visited the hospital, and they'd found a slight hemorrhage in one side of her brain, which she said, look, I don't want anybody messing around with my brain, I don't want to go under the knife. She'd just kind of, I think, given up at that stage. But that's what happened. 3 years ago in June, the hemorrhage broke, she collapsed. Thankfully, my brother was just visiting my mum at the time, and he was able to go around and be there with her and take her to the hospital. And then she passed away peacefully that afternoon, quite quickly. Again, I wasn't there to be with my mum. I was in Glastonbury. Again, I regret it, but I can't feel guilty about that. I can't put that on myself that I wasn't there for them. But it's one of those things, I don't know anybody else, if you've lost parents and you've been with them or you haven't been with them, it clearly is a precious time that you want to spend and say your goodbyes. So there we go. My wonderful parents, God bless you, Peter and Marge, no longer with me. But to this day, I think of them often, particularly on Sundays. My mum loved butterflies. I regularly see butterflies. When I remarried 2.5 years ago to my wonderful wife Emma, God bless you, there was a butterfly in the church flying around the whole ceremony when we were getting married, like literally above the beams in the church. And I know that was Marge there. I know she wanted to be at our wedding, and she was there as a butterfly, which was wonderful. And my wonderful dad Peter, thanks for inspiring me to be a filmmaker, for giving me the eyes to see and the obsession of film. That's something that I will always have to the day that I die, and I want to thank my father for that. So I really wanted to share what it means to have such wonderful, caring, creative parents that support us. I know for some of us, sometimes our parents aren't like that. Sometimes it's a bit of a struggle. Sometimes our parents don't support us in our creative journey. And please put in the comments whether that's the reality for you, whether you have parents that support you, or whether you have parents that are saying to you, why do you want to be a filmmaker? Why do you want to be a creative person? Why don't you want to be a lawyer or a doctor or a technician or these other things that pay better? That's another issue I know a lot of us creative face with our parents. But aside from that, I want to thank anyone that's watched this video to the very end. I know the subject of losing your parents is a sensitive and emotional one. My biggest advice tip, if you're dealing with grief of losing your parents, is to not keep it to yourself, is to speak to friends and family. Clearly there are many other organisations that help with grieving and support. I mean, I was fortunate enough that when I lost my dad, I'd been attending AA for a couple of weeks and I'd already got a sponsor. So when I went to meetings, that was something that I shared a lot of because with what I was dealing with at the time. But for any of you that are dealing with the loss of a parent or parents, the one thing I would suggest that is not to do is to keep quiet about it, is to keep the grief inside. We all have, the grieving process is different for everybody, but certainly for me, it was helpful that I had regular meetings where I could speak openly about what was going on for me. That wasn't about being fixed, it wasn't about being repaired, it was really just for me to express what was going on for me, my feelings, my thoughts about the whole situation. So that would be one of the key advice. If you take anything from watching this video, then that would be my biggest advice, would be to really lean in to the people around you who love and care about you and share what's going on. Clearly there's times that you want to be left alone, when there's quiet time that you want to grieve in your own space. For me, certainly the biggest benefit that supported me the most was having people around me that cared, that I could speak to, that I could tell about what was going on. And for any of you that are recently grieving the loss of a parent or parents, my love goes out to you, my support goes out to you, and I hope you get the support that you need and you don't internalize it, and that it just creates more stress, it creates more anxiety, and it creates more upset. But my love goes out to you. Thanks for watching this video, guys. Really appreciate anybody that's got to this point in the video of watching it, and I'm looking forward to putting up more videos soon. Thanks for watching. Be creative. See you soon.